The minute you grown-ass man decide to put on a pair of diapers and ask your wife to beat you with a whip, which we'll get into, something's broken. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we are doing chapter 24 of Traitor King. And this chapter is so juicy. It is one of the most shocking chapters in the book. And if you've been with me this long, you know that chapter after chapter after chapter in this book has been shocking for different reasons every time. You know, either exposing their Nazi connection, either exposing the fact that Wallace and David were so miserly and penny pinching and abusive of staff and not returning things that they had borrowed. I mean, every single element of this book has been like, whoa, that's what was going on, you know, because all of us have had some knowledge of who Wallace and David have been. Many of us have had what I would consider in-depth knowledge, and yet this book still brings it on a shocking level every time we open it. Y'all, this chapter is bananas. And the thing that I really, really respect the author for is he brings us some crazy juicy details, but very carefully making sure that it's not like just like sort of the smutty gossip. I mean, it's shocking, but he's very fair in what he presents to us. We're going to talk about the Chinese dossier, if you know what I'm talking about. This entire chapter is crazy on so many levels. And we talk about a lot of crazy things that went on behind closed doors with them. Some of it is absolutely inappropriate for children. So if you have a small child running around or little ears, or if you usually just play this and it doesn't matter who's listening, it will matter on this particular episode. This is not for little kids to hear, so, you know, wear those earplugs on this particular episode, because it's not all like shocking, but we definitely get into some stuff where I'm like, whoa, I don't even know how I'm gonna read that out loud. That is gross. So sit back, enjoy, let's go. Chapter 24 is called Relationships, and it really is answering the question of, so what was the deal with these two? It starts out by saying, the Duchess rather baffled me. Remember the wartime PR spokesman Renee McCall. I was never at my ease with her. What causes one human being to fall madly in love with another is occasionally clear to third persons. More often it remains a mystery to the onlooker. So far as I was concerned, it was emphatically a mystery in this case. It is a question that has continued to intrigue. Was the Windsors' relationship totally harmonious, or did the couple feel that they had to pretend to live out the love story that everyone wanted, even if it was not true? I am well aware that there are some people in the world who go on hoping our marriage will break up, and to them I say, give up hope, because David and I are happy, and have been happy, for 24 years. And that's the way it'll continue to be, said Wallace, because her main job in life is to continue to spread the propaganda that she'd never made a mistake in her life, that this love story that you think you're seeing really is true. But that's not what people who were watching felt. People who were looking on and people who were invited to their home, we're not sure what they were looking at when it came to the relationship between these two. What were they witnessing? Very strange, the dynamic between these two, and love hardly begins to describe it. But Wallace told McCall's magazine in 1961, for my part, I have given my husband every ounce of my affection, something he never had a great deal of in his bachelor's life. Notice I say the word affection. I believe it is an element apart from love, the deep bond one assumes as a part of marriage. You may know the phrase tender loving care. It means much the same thing. It means doing the things that uphold a man's confidence in himself, creating an atmosphere of warmth and interest, and taking his mind off of his worries. I mean, this lady, she had rewritten her behavior to such a degree that I don't think anybody who read that passage could have associated it with the way they had seen her treat David. She gave him every ounce of her affection. I mean, then she was in desperate need of some affection. If this was all that she had to give, I can't even, I mean, from what well was she drawing? Because there ain't nothing there, lady. The well of affection is dry. This is, I gave him every ounce of affection I had. What are you talking about? Because as we're going to read in this chapter, no one saw this affection that she claims to have lavished upon him. But again, the crazy thing is, it doesn't even really seem like he wanted affection. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Is that true? Asks the author. Certainly the Duke remained besotted with her all his life. Walter Monckton was later to write, "No one will ever really understand the story of the king's life. Who does not appreciate the intensity and depth of his devotion to Mrs. Simpson? To him, she was the perfect woman. She insisted that he be at his best, and do his best at all times, and he regarded her as his inspiration. It is a great mistake to imagine that he was merely in love with her in the ordinary physical sense of the term. There was an intellectual companionship, and there is no doubt that his lonely nature found in her a spiritual comradeship. He felt that he and Mrs. Simpson were made for each other, and that there was no other honest way of meeting the situation than marrying her." I think that his devotion to her was a desperation. It wasn't a love like anyone has ever seen. It wasn't healthy at all, as we'll go on to see. It was some kind of sick need for her in his life, some kind of dependency upon her that went beyond anything I've ever seen. I would love to read a book, I think, about what his childhood was like to sort of give us some color on why in the world he found his mate in this witch of a woman. Winston Churchill noticed how, quote, "he delighted in her company and found in her qualities as necessary to his happiness as the air he breathed." Those who knew him well and watched him closely noticed that many little tricks and fidgetings of nervousness fell away from him. He was a completed being instead of a sick and harassed soul. This experience, which happens to a great many people in the flower of youth, came late in life to him, and was all the more precious and compulsive for that fact. Well, I think that was Churchill's observation of it, that, all of his little fidgetings went away, but only in her presence. It's like he was only at peace if he could physically see her and know that she was there. But the text goes on to tell us that when she was not there, he was a absolute ball of anxiety and fear and agitation until he clapped eyes on her again. So the tricks, the fidgetings that, quote unquote, disappeared when she came into his life, yeah, when she was literally in his life, physically in the room. But other than that, he was a ball of anxiety always. The evidence for her affection for him is less. So he might have cared with all his little heart for her, but nobody saw the return of that affection, despite what she claims. Wallis had enjoyed the status and social contact that her relationship with the Prince of Wales brought, but it is doubtful that she was ever in love with him, or she fully considered the implications of the relationship. After George V died, she suddenly found herself involved in events she could not control. This included a relationship with a man so obsessed with her that he was prepared to commit suicide if she would not stay with him, and even to forsake the throne. By the time she wished to extricate herself from the relationship, she was stuck. I've always said that I did not believe that he would really off himself if she hadn't married him. But this chapter changed my mind about that. He had a sick obsession with her. And she was willing to appease that sickness. She was willing to go there with him in whatever twisted and broken ways he needed to experience physical arousal. Those two were sickos, straight up. And she was willing to go there with him in a way that I can assure you none of the other elite women that he had dated would have done. So, yeah, he might have decided to commit suicide because she's like the only one who would go there with him. He may have been like, "I'll never find another woman like this." Yeah, well, he's right. But to continue on in the fact that she had found herself in something she did not want to be in. As far back as the cruise on the Nehalem in August of 1936, Diana Cooper had noticed that Wallis did not want to be left alone with the king. She wrote in her diary, "The truth is she's bored stiff with him. And her picking on him and her coldness towards him, far from policy, are irritation and boredom." So it wasn't like her playing some cute little cat and mouse game where she was teasing him and picking at him and it was something that they both sort of enjoyed. For her part, she did it because she despised him. He annoyed her, and she made no bones about it. The sick thing is, he loved that. He loved to be demeaned. Because, you live your whole life and everyone's kowtowing to you. It would be sort of fun to have somebody who was willing to stand up to you. But she more than stood up to him. She stood up to him and then belittled him. And it would be a sick soul that enjoyed that part of it. Now, the spunky girl who's willing to ignore your status and talk to you like a human being, totally can see why that would be interesting. But the continual verbal abuse, and you like it and you want it? Gee, what's going on, man? One area of hurt throughout the relationship was her status and how she was treated. It began as soon as he abdicated, with long telephone calls to Austria about finances and status, and continued throughout the 35 years they were married, much of her venom directed against his family. Kenneth DeCourcy remembers that part of her great mischief was that she went at him morning, noon, and night, and right up to 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, steaming up against his family. She went on and on and on and on. Because she did not have the backbone to get out of this thing that she was in. She was going to blame him and make his life miserable. And a different man would not have taken that. And he certainly wouldn't have manipulated this into some kind of display of sexual tension between the two of them. He wouldn't have looked at this as something alluring to be belittled by this woman. You know, she had every chance to walk away if she wanted to, and she chose not to. And now she's going to spend the rest of her life harassing him about her in-laws. I mean, can you even imagine a more discouraging lifestyle to be married to somebody who will browbeat you until 2 o'clock in the morning about your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister? It's like, who could stand it? But he not only stood it, he wanted more. The Duchess was a complicated person, to say the least. And Dr. Gail Lionheart, who's the stepdaughter of Wallace's ghostwriter, Cleveland Amory, said that she was cold, mean-spirited, a bully, and a sadist. Dr. Lionheart said, "My parents found the Duke not very bright, a wimp, and basically a very sad man. He made an appalling choice, and he knew that he had taken the wrong path, and now had to live with the consequences. They found him pathetic." This opinion, I think, to me, that, he just had made a bad choice and, he was going to have to live with it. I think that's a bit shallow. I think that there was more to it than this, because if he really felt like he couldn't, I've made my choice, I've made my bed, I have to lie in it, it would seem like he wouldn't have followed her around so like a sad little puppy looking for his master. It would seem to me that, okay, I've made my bed, I gotta lie in it, but she's gonna have her affairs, I'm gonna have mine too. I don't care if she's not hanging around at the house with me, whatever, I don't care. The way this Dr. Lionheart paints it, he was just a sad man who had made his choice, and, he realized it was my choice, but like, what's he gonna do now? He abdicated for this woman. No, I think it's way deeper than that. I think that was probably the way she felt, because she clearly went about her own life and didn't really care about the guy she had married. She's having affairs right, left, and center. She's, spending money like there's no tomorrow. She's browbeating him until 2 o'clock in the morning. She obviously was going to live her life no matter whether they were married or not. But that's not how David was. David really wanted there to be a spark between the two of them. And he was fine with the counterfeit spark of this constant browbeating and told himself that this was some kind of sexual tension between the two of them. The book goes on to fully support the idea that he liked the way Wallace treated him. The author says, in some ways it was Wallace's very dominant manner that most appealed to the Duke. Writing to his mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, in January of 1920, he had told her, "You ought to be really foul to me sometimes, and curse and be cruel. It would do me worlds of good, and bring me to my right senses. I think I'm the kind of man who needs a certain amount of cruelty, without which he gets abominably spoilt and soft. I feel that's what's the matter with me." So he knew full well there was something the matter with him. But his prescription is odd. I want you to curse and be cruel to me. Not like stand up to me sometimes. Don't let me walk all over you, just because I'm heir to the throne, come on, like treat me like an equal. That would be a fine request. But this to say you ought to curse and be cruel to me, it's what I need. Really? Okay, interesting take. There was certainly a strong masochist and dom-sub aspect to the couple's relationship, both sexually and in everyday life. She was harsh, dominating, often abominably rude, wrote Philip Ziegler in The Official Life. She treated the prince at the best like a child who needed keeping in order, at the worst with contempt. But he invited it and begged for more. She dominated the Duke, but he did not just put up with it. He actually liked it, remembered Cleveland Amory. And this wasn't just the opinion of a couple of people who sort of thought maybe that was true. Everybody who witnessed them said that she was hateful to him on every conceivable level, but that he almost seemed to pleasure in her unkindness, even to the point of making him cry. Mona Eldridge, who met the Windsors on numerous occasions while still working for the Woolworth heiress and socialite Barbara Hutton, later wrote, Barbara also believed that Wallace had a sense of having been cheated by life. At times, she would sound bitter and implied that her husband had failed her, that he had not kept his promise. She had a way of denigrating him by reminding him that he had let her down again. People on her staff told me how she would reprimand the Duke like a harsh mother with a naughty child, not infrequently reducing him to tears. And paradoxically, this only caused him to cling more tightly to her. It's almost like he was afraid that she would leave him, and so when she was mean to him, it didn't drive him away, it made him come closer. He would fawn all over her in an attempt to get her to stay and to calm her rage. But then I also think that he had to learn to substitute real affection and real feeling for whatever this weird anxiety was that existed between them. That, I think, is what he had begun to interpret as some sort of spark of relational health. Well, I feel something when I'm with her, even though what I feel is the tears coursing down my cheeks. At least I'm feeling something. Charles Murphy recollected on one occasion a journalist called on their Paris home to collect a manuscript from the Duke. And the journalist remembers hearing the Duchess rant at him for littering the dinner table with his papers. I've got 20 guests dining here in 2 hours. Why didn't you make this mess somewhere else? The dining room was his only office, and he had no other choice. And according to the journalist, he said, these are David's exact words, Darling, are you going to send me to bed in tears again tonight? It's like the weirdest statement. It's like almost challenging her to make him sad, and he lives off of it. Like he wants to go to bed crying that night. It's like, oh, don't hit me again. Oh, don't hit me again. Oh, don't hit me again. It's like, you weird sicko. What is this that you are getting out of this relationship? He's challenging her to make him sad. He was a hurting individual. Sickness is what we're looking at. He was like a child in her hands, Lady Alexander Metcalf told Cleveland Amory, poor little man. He was given hell. It was a stranglehold she had over him. He never had any real mothering. She never had any children. And both needed each other. Weak and below average intelligence, the Duke needed a woman to dominate him with abjectness, which former girlfriends had found so disconcerting. The result was that he was completely dependent on his wife. He was not, like I said previously, going to find somebody who would do to him the way she did to him. In many ways, the Duke had never properly grown up physically or emotionally. Childhood mumps may have led to a hormonal imbalance. And this is when we're going to wade into some very murky waters about how his physical and emotional and mental well-being was all sort of wrapped up in this potentially morphed package of having had childhood mumps. Alan Lascelles wrote in his diary, Wise old Dawson of Penn told me several times that he was convinced that EP's moral development, not physical, had for some reason been arrested in his adolescence, and that would account for this limitation he seemed to have, this physical and emotional limitation. Lascelles goes on to say, an outward symptom of such arrestation, Dawson says, was the absence of hair on the face of the subject. EP only had to shave about once a week. EP standing for Edward Princeps. Now, interesting. I would say that's a bit of a stretch to be like, oh, since he didn't have a lot of facial hair, that's because of the childhood mumps, which also is why he's so physically and emotionally immature. I don't know, seems a bit of a stretch, but let's keep going because interesting statements are about to follow. Frank Giles showered with the Duke in 1940 after a game of golf and noticed that he, quote, had absolutely no hair on his body, even in the places where one would most expect it to be. So you had an adolescent body, he had an adolescent mind. And the Duke, in all of this arrested development, both physically, mentally, and emotionally, worshipped his wife, and he trusted her. He felt secure with her and was restless when she was not there. This goes back to what I was saying. Churchill says that, for whatever reason, Wallace helped him to stop being so nervous, but only in her presence. When she was present, he watched her every moment, listened to her every word, and responded to every inflection in her voice, remembered Mona Elbridge. He often said that nothing was too good for her. His wife was constantly in his thoughts, later wrote Dinah Hood. If he went out alone, he looked for her the moment he returned home. If she went out without him and remained away for any length of time, he became nervous and preoccupied. She added, I have seen him in the middle of a haircut in his dressing room get up and run to his wife, leaving his astonished hairdresser agape. If he was in a room and she came in, the moment she came in the room, he became vivacious. He became happy. He became full of life. It was just amazing, recollected Dudley Forwood. You know, in a lot of ways, it's very much like a child who has an extreme attachment to its mother and cannot be pried out of her arms for any reason. You know, like the child that will scream and scream and scream and scream and cry when they're dropped off at preschool and they just cannot manage. You know, he's got this very immature and unhealthy attachment to her. But I also think that his behavior also is like a lover who knows that the person that they're with is cheating on them. His preoccupation with what she's doing when she's not there, his desperation to know where she is at all times, his panic that if she's in the next room and he can't see her, that something might be going on. You know, on the one hand, you could say it's very childlike, like a little child looking for his mother. On the other hand, it's like a jilted lover who knows that the entire relationship is lopsided and that he is in love with her and she could care less. I have rarely seen an ascendancy established over one partner in a marriage by the other to so remarkable a degree, Frank Giles remembered. He seemed to revel in being with the Duchess, in sunning himself in her smile, in admiring her appearance, in listening to her conversation. Truly, he seemed to have been under a spell. He seemed completely incapable of criticizing her on any level, even when the things that she was doing was fully appropriate to have criticized. Her having that affair just in his face, rubbing in his face, being hateful and cruel about it. And he never once said, I wish that that wasn't happening. You need to stop. If he ever raised a word of criticism, it was to Jimmy Donahue when he, assaulted Wallace under the table, kicking her and, tearing her stocking and making her bleed, simply because he didn't care for a comment that she had made. And then finally, the Duke bestirs himself to scream at Jimmy Donahue, but never once would he have raised his voice in frustration at the way that Wallace was treating him. Kenneth de Courcy says, I've never known any person so totally obsessed by the personality of another. He seems to me to retain no individuality at all. Whenever she was present and when we were alone, he constantly jumps up looking for her or asking on the house telephone where she is. Did she love the Duke of Windsor? I'm afraid the sad answer is that she did not. She admires him and she likes him, but it never went further, and I think he knew it. And it was that which made him restless and induced him to concede his very innermost person to her authority in the hope that love would come. She never learned to love the Duke, and in my opinion, she never ever experienced love at all for anyone. It's really, really sad. Like, his whole life is completely and totally pathetic. To have abdicated the throne for this woman who he sits at the feet of and constantly looks up, sort of, tugging on her skirt for a little attention. It's so pathetic and sad, but it gets so much worse. The following bit, here is my little statement to you. It's about to get gross here, friends, okay? Let's talk about the total sexual perversion that's going on in this home. So he abdicated the throne to be the whipping boy, quite literally, of this woman. And this is what his life has come to. Somebody who is constantly cheating on him, leaving him, berating him, and now this. Given the speculation over the relationship, what was the nature of the couple's sex life? The FBI reported, after interviewing Father Oda, that Wallace had, quote, told certain individuals that the Duke is impotent, and that although he had tried sexual intercourse with numerous women, he had been unsuccessful in satisfying his passions. Which sort of then does raise the question of, how did he have all of these potential children roaming about the globe? Remember that chapter when we talked about all of his many, many, many children? Some in New Zealand and, all these places. If he cannot complete the act, how does one get pregnant by this man? Questions linger. According to the story related by Father Oda, the Duchess, in her own inimitable and unique manner, had been the only woman who had been able to satisfactorily gratify the Duke's sexual desires. Well, what might we mean by that? Stay tuned. Count Edward Bismarck told Gorvidal that, quote, Wallace's sexual hold of the Duke was that only she knew how to control his premature ejaculation. The prince had sexual problems. He was unable to perform, Lady Gladwin, wife of former British ambassador in Paris, told Hugo Vickers. And Hugo Vickers had a conversation with her all about this, and he related it. He said that she said it was all over before it began. She called it a hairpin reaction. Lady Gladwin had said that the Duchess coped with it. I commented she was meant to have learned special ways in China. And Lady Gladwin says, there's nothing Chinese about it. It was what they call oral sex. So, you know, in a day and age in which that was not necessarily one of the go-to behaviors, activities that one might do in one's bedroom, it was really shocking that she would have engaged in this kind of behavior. It was not done. And which is why Edward was never going to find anybody else who's going to do that for him. All the other ladies he was seeing, nuh-uh. They're not down for that job. And Wallace was. And where he had felt unable to perform and probably felt quite repressed, she managed to find a way to satisfy him. I think it would be very difficult if you had never experienced that, like, intimacy, a completed intimacy with anybody, and then you find somebody who is willing to figure out a way that works for you. I think it would be very difficult for any man to want to abandon that. Okay, but what of this Chinese stuff? You know, because Hugo Vickers is over there gossiping with Lady Gladwin. Oh, she's meant to have learned special ways in China. You know, and how many times have I read that in the comments? So let's deal with it. What's the Chinese stuff about? What hung over Wallace was the supposed existence of the Chinese dossier relating to her activities in China, mainly sexual, but also political. One of the 3 reports supposedly gathered by the British Intelligence Service and shown to George V in 1935. It was said that members of the government and royal household had seen it, but its details remained vague. Tommy Dugdale, then parliamentary private secretary to the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, told Kenneth de Courcy that the intelligence service had a case against Mrs. Simpson, which, if we could but read it, would entirely change our attitude. And Kenneth de Courcy was told about it by Sir John Coke, Queen Mary's equerry, in the 1950s. He noted in a memo that, quote, he had read the secret dossier on the Duchess of Windsor, some details of which he told me, and said that he had recommended Churchill. He says that her personal record is so shocking that no English gentleman would properly advise Queen Mary ever to receive her or in any way relent. He assured me of such facts and challenges me to say whether, having heard such facts, I could tell him that he should advise Queen Mary to relent. I replied that if the allegations were true, I could not. It does shed some light on why Queen Mary was so angry that Edward had chosen Wallace. If she had been told any of these details, even minorly, everyone around the Queen is so shocked about it. All these men are so shocked that this has happened and are saying, you know, under no conditions should she be seen in the same place with this person. Because if anybody else out there knows what Wallace has been up to and has done, it's going to really reflect poorly on Queen Mary. De Courcy remembered parts of the dossier, including that she'd got power over Count Charlotte amongst other people in that way, and had an illegitimate child by Charlotte, and abortion. And that's why she had this internal problem all her life, according to de Courcy. What this internal problem is, I do not know. I don't know, with like this inability to have children, I mean, what exactly are they talking about? I don't know. She did seem like she was in the hospital a lot for various things, but it was like stomach cancer and things like that, and facelifts. The existence of the China dossier has never been proven. Even so, Dudley Forwood told Charles Higham in 1987, the techniques Wallace discovered in China did not entirely overcome the prince's extreme lack of virility. It is doubtful whether he and Wallace ever actually had sexual intercourse in the normal sense of the word. However, she did manage to give him relief. Okay, you guys, we're about to get into some crazy things. This is so wild to me. I feel like we live in a day and age in which everybody's like crazy weirdness is splashed all over the pages all the time. And, you know, you become aware of people's weird sexual desires just through the course of walking through the world now, because everybody's sexuality is on display constantly and continually. But I had no idea that people back then were engaging in such twisted things. I guess there's nothing new under the sun, but let's keep going. She did manage to give him relief. He had always been a repressed foot fetishist, and she discovered this and indulged the perversity completely. They also, at his request, oh, you guys, became involved in elaborate erotic games. These included nanny child scenes. He wore diapers. She was the master. She was dominant. He happily submissive. Ah, diapers. Diapers? What? I mean, it's one thing to have sorted out in your own mind that the way your wife talks to you is some kind of, fun sexual, I don't know, foreplay or something. Like, if you've intentionally decided to misrepresent her dismissive words to you and her belittling words to you as some kind of fun little challenge, okay, fine, whatever. I mean, I think that in and of itself is the evidence that you are very internally broken. If you are willing to look at somebody belittling you as some kind of fun sexual arousal game. But the minute you grown-ass man decide to put on a pair of diapers and ask your wife to beat you with a whip, which we'll get into, something's broken. Nicky Haslam agrees about the infantilism. I mean nappies, he says. They were all sexually screwed up by Queen Mary. Potty Gloucester, the Duke's brother, liked wearing Queen Mary's clothes, though he wasn't gay. The Duke was certainly gay, I know that for a fact. Queen Mary, the last royal to believe in the divine right of kings, had never interfered in the callous bullying that George V meted out to his children. Of course, none of them came up to George V for horrors, says Diana Mosley. There's a ghastly photograph in my book where they're being drilled by their father and they're all in floods. I mean, too awful. Being bullied as a little boy, given orders and punishing for being naughty, Michael Block gathered from his sources, were to the Duke's taste. Somewhere along the line, this boy decided that being verbally and physically abused was something positive. There was something that he gained from it. There was some kind of excitement in it for him. Charles Wilson, whose mother was married to Ulick Alexander, keeper of the Privy Purse, was told by her that Edward gained pleasure from being beaten by Wallis, who delivered the strokes with her own small whip. He needed the stimulus, I think, in order to perform in the normal manner, something with which he had great difficulty in earlier relationships. It was at a country house party where the then Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson were guests that the prince's private detective came to Ulick one morning with some worrying discoveries. He produced a pair of the prince's underpants striped with caked blood and a small whip that he found in Mrs. Simpson's underwear drawer. There is no doubt that Edward loved Wallis, but he was frightened of her, and this she was quick to exploit. So you're like, whoa, I'm up to here with the crazy right now. Diapers, whips, what the heck? But it doesn't get less weird. In 2012, Scotty Bowers, a Hollywood barman, published his memoirs, Full Service, My Adventures in Hollywood and the Secret Sex Lives of the Stars, in which he claimed he had sexually procured men and women for numerous Hollywood stars from 1946. Amongst his clients were Sir Cecil Beaton, who wrote of Bowers in his published diaries, Noel Coward and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Chapter 14 in the book, called A Royal Affair, is devoted to the couple, claiming that during the late 40s and early 50s, Cecil Beaton had introduced them to Bowers, saying that the Duke was a classic example of a bisexual man and that Wallis Simpson shared similar bisexual urges. But, quote, essentially he was gay and she was a dyke. According to Bowers, quote, he and I slipped into the guest house at the bottom of the large garden, stripped off and began making out. Eddie was good, really good. And according to this person, whose words I will not say, Edward performed the dreaded job and was quite good at it. Over the next few days, Bowers writes that he supplied a nice young guy for Eddie and a pretty dark-haired girl for Wally. Each time I sent somebody different. The royal couple enjoyed variety. Bowers wrote that Wallis, quote, was not in any way inhibited. She was very fond of dark-haired women, usually those with hair color similar to her own. Wally really knew what she was doing. She did it in style and with intense passion. But one might say, how much can we trust this Bowers person? I mean, he says this is true, but how do we know it? Well, the author goes on to lay great claims to the fact that this Bowers person, though coming up with some really wild stories, can be believed because multiple sources have tested whether he could be believed or not, and he's come up clear every time. Amongst those who confirmed that Bowers' stories were true were Gore Vidal, who spoke at the book launch, film director John Schlesinger, and the novelist Dominic Dunne. The film director Lionel Friedberg, who ghosted Full Service, spent 150 hours with Scotty over several months, consistently testing him for accuracy. Not once did he deviate from what he had said before. He had a photographic memory down to remembering number plates from years before. I don't think he could tell a lie. I don't doubt that everything he said about the Windsors was true. Now, my only contention with a statement like that is, yes, a person who consistently tells the same story is probably telling the truth. But if he tells you what the license plate on a car was, how do you know whether that's true or not? You didn't see the license plate. So he could be like, yeah, and then the car drove by with 87651. Okay, well, how do you know? Anyway, other people also confirmed. A documentary, Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, directed by Matt Tyrannauer, was released in 2017. Tyrannauer, who told me he interviewed Bowers on and off camera over a 3-year period, confirms that his independent reporting lined up with the information in Friedberg's earlier interviews. Additionally, Tyrannauer interviewed more than 40 friends and associates of Bowers, including men who were sex workers at Bowers' gas station in the 1950s, all of whom corroborated Bowers. Friedberg's views about Bowers' veracity are as follows. Everything I put in the movie checks out, either in printed documents, books, manuscripts, diaries, newspaper clips, etc. It all matches up. Details regarding homes and home addresses and architectural features of homes he was in that he could not have possibly known unless he was in the house. Also sources who were with him at the time who confirmed events. Obviously, I could not prove everything he told me, but that would have been beyond the scope of my project. Whenever I went to check something, it panned out. What in the world? What in the world is happening behind the closed doors of the Duke and Duchess? You know, I mean, wild. Okay, so that's the way she's dealing with it behind closed doors. Using and abusing him, beating him with a whip, making him put on diapers, you know, getting call girls, all of this. It's a hot mess on the inside. On the outside, the Duchess that we see is coping in other ways. According to Wallace, my husband gave up everything for me. If everyone looks at me when I enter a room, my husband can feel proud of me, Wallace told Elsa Maxwell. That's my chief responsibility. The result was that Wallace spent a fortune on her appearance and clothes. The Duchess was not conventionally good-looking, with a prominent jaw and outsized hands, but she ate carefully, under the guidance of the nutritionist Gaylord Hauser, with the result at 5 foot 4 inches, she rarely weighed over 100 pounds, with measurements of 34-inch bust, 22-inch waist, and 34-inch hips. Aileen Romanonis remembered how her shoes were always shined underneath, on the instep and inside the heel, as they could be seen when the legs were crossed, and that she always carried an extra pair of white gloves in her bag, 1 pair to go, 1 pair to come back. In the 1930s, her favorite designers were Mainbacher and Schiaparelli, but by the 1950s, she had switched to Dior, Balenciaga, and Chanel, and she even experimented with pantsuits in the 1950s and miniskirts in the 1960s. She made the short evening dress fashionable, as well as, because of her flat chest, high-necked evening gowns. So the way she saw life is that as all eyes were on her, she needed to look her best, and she needed to make people understand why the Duke had chosen her, both with her complete and total propaganda to say magazines like McCall's saying that her highest priority was affection for him, but then also looking like an absolute fashion plate every time she went out. Of course, all this came at a great cost. The Duchess bought clothes from several couturiers, and she would beat the prices down on the pretext that she would advertise the clothes that she wore, remembers Mona Eldridge. Both she and the Duke were notorious for their stinginess, resorting to all sorts of shameless deceits to avoid paying bills. In the case of the Duke, it was pathological. During the 1950s, staff were used to increasingly angry letters and calls from unpaid suppliers, not the least jewelry houses, Cartier and Van Cleef. The result was that a deal was struck that Wallace would borrow jewels for public events as long as the name of the designer was leaked to the press, and they were returned promptly. I cannot even imagine what they were thinking by letting her walk off with any of their jewelry, especially because she never ever was paying for anything, and she was notorious for not returning things. They should have had a member of the House of Cartier follow her wherever she went to pick it up after the event was over. Like, I cannot imagine letting it go to her house and then, you know, that's that. I mean, you think you're ever going to see it again? The book goes on to say that the Windsors only kept to the first part of the bargain, far as borrowing it and dropping the name of the designer. They borrowed, but they didn't return. Unfortunately, it's no longer possible to identify which items in the collection were paid for and which were not. A wholesale clear out of all correspondence at the time of the Duchess's death in 1986 ensured that we shall never know the full extent of this dishonesty. However, one former servant said grimly, "Rarely was anything ever handed back." She may have looked like an absolute dream in all of her beautiful clothes and her beautiful jewelry, but she was no more no better than a common thief. She had access to these things, but her behavior was as low class and low down as they come. And, nobody could, people just could not understand this whirl of gaiety that they lived in and how this was supposed to equal a meaningful life, that he could have had a meaningful life. And even now, after he'd abdicated, he could have done something with his life that was meaningful, but he just does not seem to possess the ability to live any kind of a life with meaning. People who looked on, one person being Courtney d'Espel, who married Wallace's former lover, succinctly wrote at the time of the abdication, "Today, in my humble opinion, England must feel luckier to be rid of a man so weak, this Jekyll and Hyde king of so little inner stability and yet such outward charm. They have ahead of them years in which to decide where to live. They'll have no country and he, quote, no job. Can any love exist or be nourished on this slender fare? For Edward is no longer a king. In her eyes, he can only be a poor, weak man who depends on her now, who has given away his all. Can they dance every night at a different cabaret to keep life gay?" Exactly. It's like, who cares about the pretty picture? It's like, can you really live on yet one more new dress? Can that really get you through life? The problem with the Windsors was that they were superficial people with little sense of obligation and few interests. So I guess if that's the sort of person you are, you actually can get through life just one new dress at a time. When pressed, a friend of Wallace's came up with, "Well, they like gossip, and they're really good at housekeeping." Wallace herself said that her talent was, quote, getting people to talk. The art historian John Richardson says of her, "She was a society rattle, straight out of Thackeray in a way. She must have been like one of those Regency ladies around George IV, prattling away in this hideous voice. Funny." The food at her home was always superb, and she got it right. It wasn't too overdone. The place always looked very attractive, wonderful flowers and modern American touches. You could be sure that cocktails were superb, but the conversation was idiotic. How could it be anything other? How could it be? Because these people have nothing to talk about. They don't read, they don't know about anything, they're not interested in anything, and the Duke's idea of politics was so outdated and so unbelievably askew and shallow. You couldn't even talk about politics and come away being like, that was edifying. The Duke and Duchess led totally self-centered lives. There was no consideration for anything but the gratification of their own needs. The life they led was born out of disappointment, frustration, and unfulfilled expectations. It was a really empty life, but it was what they enjoyed, noted John Utter. She loved anything to do with the party. They were wretched personalities, completely egocentric. That's interesting coming from her private secretary, who I think was sort of out to get her in the end. Sort of the pot calling the kettle black, if you want to talk about a wretched personality, but whatever. Their ambitions were partially satisfied by creating beautiful homes and an extensive social life with equally shallow people. But there was a restlessness as they relentlessly entertained and partied and traveled as if escaping from something. Each other, the past, responsibility. Certainly both were escaping from unhappy childhoods, his emotionally barren, hers in terms of wealth and status. Contrary to a great love story, Wallace had been emotionally blackmailed into marriage and had stuck with it because she had no other option. She had been attracted to the Prince of Wales and King, but that attraction had waned after he had given up his throne, leading to a mixture of guilt, pity, dissatisfaction, boredom, and irritation. The affairs, the constant shopping, the travel and entertaining were an attempt to provide some stimulation in a life with little meaning and with a man she did not love. She did not love him. For any of those people who want to still say that it was some kind of divine love story, it was not in any context. She did not love him, and that is extraordinarily clear in this text. She had zero interest in him, and she was making do with the lot that she had. Such a good chapter. Oh my goodness. The next time we come together, it's going to be very short. I'll be surprised if it's 10 minutes long. It's a very short chapter. It just wraps up the book and talks about what this book proved, and it certainly proved a lot. It proved that the Duke and the Duchess, that it was not a love story, that they were deeply embedded with the Nazis, and that pretty much everything we ever thought we knew about this couple was wrong. It's such an interesting book. No other author has ever taken it from the abdication on, and that's what makes this so interesting, is that we always got, like, you know, all the way up into the abdication, maybe a little bit about what happened afterwards, but no real true talk about who these people really were. So it's such an excellent book. Again, we have one last chapter and then we're done, but then we're on to the Diana book. So I'm super excited about that. and I'm really excited for all of you to join me for it. I'll see you guys later. Bye.